March 19, 1942. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. A light rain falls on a gathering of military officials huddled beneath a canvas tent. 20 yards away, an ordinary-looking man in a rumpled civilian suit kneels beside a peculiar contraption, a cobbled-together assembly of pipes, valves, and what appears to be modified plumbing fixtures. The generals exchange skeptical glances as Private Edwin Walters, recently an Army janitor and before that, a high school dropout with no formal engineering training, prepares to demonstrate his invention. "Another crackpot with another useless gadget," mutters Colonel Harold Bingham, checking his watch impatiently. By nightfall, the Pentagon would be scrambling to classify everything they'd witnessed. Within a week, Walters' device would be in production at 17 different manufacturing facilities across America. Within 6 months, it would save the lives of over 2,000 Allied soldiers in the North African campaign alone. The contraption looked absurdly simple, almost comical in its improvised appearance. Military engineers with doctoral degrees and decades of experience had dismissed it without testing. "Theoretically impossible," wrote Major Leonard Phillips, the Aberdeen facility's chief ballistics expert, in his initial assessment. "Not worth the brass's time." Yet something about Walters' quiet confidence had caught the attention of Lieutenant Sophia Reynolds, a junior officer who risked her career to arrange this demonstration. As Walters made final adjustments to his device, Reynolds stood slightly apart from the other officers, her expression betraying both hope and anxiety. She had staked everything on the intuition that this former janitor had somehow solved a problem that had been killing American tank crews by the hundreds. The problem was simple to understand, but had proven devastatingly difficult to solve. German Panzer tanks were systematically destroying American Sherman tanks in North Africa, their superior armor rendering American anti-tank weapons virtually useless. American crews called their vehicles death traps and cremation boxes. The standard American bazooka, designed to penetrate enemy armor, routinely failed against the reinforced frontal plates of German tanks. What the military needed was a weapon that could defeat German armor without requiring entirely new manufacturing capabilities amidst the all-consuming production demands of global war. Edwin Walters had spent 17 years as a janitor at Westinghouse before being drafted into the Army at age 35, where he was immediately assigned to custodial duties at Aberdeen based on his civilian employment history. During evening cleanup in the testing facilities, he would study discarded reports and examine failed prototypes destined for the scrap heap. Military researchers had been approaching the problem from a perspective of increased power, more explosive force, higher velocities, heavier projectiles. Walters saw something different, something that had been invisible to the experts precisely because of their expertise. As rain intensified around the test field, Walters nodded to Lieutenant Reynolds. "We're ready, ma'am." His voice carried the soft accent of rural Pennsylvania, devoid of the confident authority the assembled officers expected from someone proposing to revolutionize anti-tank warfare. Reynolds turned toward Brigadier General Thomas Montgomery, the highest-ranking officer present. "Sir, Private Walters requests permission to proceed with the demonstration." Montgomery glanced at his watch again. "He has exactly 15 minutes, not a second more." The general's tone made clear his expectation of failure. Walters carried his device, weighing less than 27 pounds, to a firing position 100 yards from an actual German Panzer tank captured in Libya. The military had expended over 300 conventional anti-tank rounds against this same vehicle during previous tests, managing only superficial damage to its armored hull. Walters took a moment to survey the scene, seemingly oblivious to both the rain now soaking through his clothing and the skeptical stares of the assembled brass. What happened next would later be described in classified Pentagon reports as the single most significant infantry weapon breakthrough of the entire European campaign. Walters aimed his peculiar device at the tank, adjusted a valve mechanism of his own design, and fired a single round. The projectile traveled with an unusual spiraling trajectory, striking the tank at precisely the junction between the turret and hull. Instead of exploding on impact like conventional anti-tank rounds, the projectile performed exactly as Walters had predicted in his hand-drawn schematics. It briefly adhered to the surface, then drove a focused, superheated penetrator through the armor using a two-stage ignition process. A moment of silence followed, then a bright flash from inside the tank. Had the observation team been able to see inside the vehicle, they would have witnessed what later testing confirmed. Walter's projectile had penetrated 7 inches of hardened German steel, creating a pathway just wide enough for the secondary incendiary component to enter the crew compartment. In actual combat, this would have instantly incapacitated the tank and its crew. Colonel Bingham broke the stunned silence. "What in God's name did we just witness?" Edwin Walters, still kneeling in the mud, replied with the simplicity that characterized both his personality and his breakthrough. "It doesn't fight the armor, sir. It bypasses it." The brilliance of Walters' innovation wasn't just the penetration capability, but the fact that his device could be manufactured using existing production facilities with minimal retooling. Unlike other proposed solutions that would have required months or years of new production infrastructure, Walters' design could be implemented immediately. As he would explain during intensive debriefings over the following 72 hours, he had conceived the entire system while unclogging drains in the Aberdeen Proving Ground barracks. "Plumbing taught me that you don't always need to break the pipe to clear the blockage," Walters told increasingly senior officers, as word of his demonstration traveled up the chain of command. "Sometimes you navigate around the problem instead of trying to force through it." The remarkable journey that brought Edwin Walters to that rainy demonstration field began 35 years earlier in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Born to a coal miner father, who died of black lung disease before Edwin's 10th birthday, and a mother who supported 5 children by working double shifts at a textile factory, Walters' early life offered little indication of the creative genius that would eventually save thousands of Allied lives. Margaret Walters had recognized something special in her middle child, an unusual spatial intelligence that manifested in his ability to disassemble and reassemble virtually any mechanical device. By age 7, Edwin had repaired the family's broken radio after the local repair shop had declared it beyond salvation. By 12, he had constructed a functional bicycle from discarded parts found in neighborhood trash bins. But formal education proved difficult for young Edwin, whose reading difficulties and social awkwardness made him a target for both teachers' frustration and classmates' ridicule. "He sees things differently," Margaret would tell concerned school administrators. "His mind works in ways yours and mine don't." Edwin dropped out of school at 16, despite his mother's tearful protests. Unable to complete the written application tests for mechanical apprenticeships, he accepted a janitorial position at Westinghouse, where for 17 years he performed his assigned duties with quiet competence while using his access to observe engineers and study discarded technical documentation. Night watchmen frequently discovered him examining damaged machinery in the plant's repair shop long after his shift had ended, though these unauthorized activities were generally tolerated because he often left the broken equipment in functioning condition. Theodore Lawson, a Westinghouse engineer who would later provide testimony to the Army's Technology Acquisition Board, recalled encountering Walters late one evening in 1938. "I found him completely disassembled a hydraulic press that had been malfunctioning for weeks. Parts were arranged in a precise pattern across the floor. Before I could reprimand him, he pointed to a hairline fracture in a valve component that our entire engineering team had missed. The man had no formal training, couldn't explain the physics or mathematics involved, but somehow understood the machinery on an intuitive level that I've never witnessed before or since." When military conscription reached 35-year-olds in early 1942, Walters received his draft notice with the same quiet acceptance that characterized his response to most life events. His Westinghouse supervisor offered to request an occupational deferment, but Walters declined. "Others are going," he reportedly said. "No reason I shouldn't." The Army, however, had little interest in the unconventional talents of a middle-aged janitor with an 8th-grade education. Following basic training, where drill instructors found him physically adequate but socially awkward, Walters was assigned to maintenance duties at Aberdeen Proving Ground, essentially continuing his civilian role but in military uniform. This assignment, intended to utilize his limited skill set in a non-combat role, inadvertently placed him at the nexus of America's weapons development program during a critical period of the war. Lieutenant Sophia Reynolds, 29 and recently transferred to Aberdeen from an administrative post in Washington, first encountered Walters while working late one evening in the Technical Documentation Center. Finding him reviewing discarded test reports while supposedly emptying trash receptacles, she initially assumed he was engaged in espionage and nearly reported him to security officers. "I'm allowed to clean in here," Walters explained when confronted, his voice carrying neither defensiveness nor alarm. "Nobody said I couldn't read what gets thrown away." Rather than reporting the incident, Reynolds engaged him in conversation and discovered to her astonishment that this unassuming janitor had not only understood the technical reports, but had identified fundamental flaws in the engineering approaches they described. Initially skeptical, she tested his insights by presenting technical problems outside his observed reading. His solutions, delivered without pretension or scientific terminology, demonstrated an intuitive grasp of physics and materials science that both impressed and confounded her. Over the following weeks, Reynolds, herself an overlooked talent with a chemistry degree from Vassar College, at a time when the military relegated most female officers to clerical duties, began sharing the most pressing technical challenges facing Allied forces. The anti-tank problem, with its mounting human cost on the battlefields of North Africa, became their focus. While established research teams pursued incremental improvements to existing designs, Walters approached the problem from first principles, unencumbered by conventional weapons theory or institutional constraints. "The current approach makes a fundamental error," he explained while mopping the laboratory floor after hours. "They're trying to defeat the armor through brute force, but armor always wins that contest. It's why tanks exist in the first place. The question isn't how to penetrate with more force, it's how to penetrate with less." This seemingly paradoxical statement reflected the conceptual breakthrough that distinguished Walters' approach. Rather than designing a larger weapon to defeat increasingly thick armor, he conceived a system that would identify and exploit structural vulnerabilities inherent in tank design. Drawing on his years of maintenance experience, Walters recognized that even the most robust systems have necessary weak points, joints, seams, and access points that cannot be eliminated without compromising functionality. Using scavenged materials from the Aberdeen maintenance shops and modified plumbing components, whose potential military applications had been overlooked, Walters constructed his first prototype over 6 nights of solitary work. The device utilized a revolutionary targeting mechanism, inspired improbably by the directional water flow regulators he had maintained in industrial restrooms. This mechanism allowed his projectile to identify and exploit the slight gap that necessarily exists between a tank's main body and its rotating turret, a vulnerability that exists by engineering necessity but represents less than 1% of the vehicle's surface area. When Walters first explained his concept to Reynolds, she immediately grasped its potential significance, but faced a daunting obstacle: how to arrange an official demonstration for a janitor's homemade weapon when established research teams with prestigious credentials had projects scheduled months in advance. The institutional resistance proved even more formidable than expected. "A janitor's pipe bomb," scoffed Colonel Wendell Harriman, the officer overseeing anti-tank weapons development, when Reynolds first approached him. "Lieutenant, we have physicists from MIT working on this problem. I suggest you focus on your assigned duties and leave weapons development to qualified personnel." Undeterred, Reynolds executed a bold bureaucratic maneuver that risked her military career. Using her position in the documentation office, she located and engaged Brigadier General Montgomery, whose reputation for prioritizing battlefield results over institutional protocol made him her best potential ally. Circumventing her direct chain of command, a serious breach of military procedure, she arranged a brief meeting during the general's inspection visit. "Sir, I believe we have overlooked a solution that could save thousands of American lives," she told him, during a carefully orchestrated accidental encounter. "I'm prepared to accept full responsibility if I'm wasting your time, including immediate resignation of my commission." Montgomery, whose own son was serving in a tank battalion preparing for deployment, granted her 5 minutes. Those 5 minutes resulted in the demonstration scheduled for March 19th, a demonstration that military historians would later identify as a pivotal moment in the Allied weapons development program. Following the successful demonstration, events moved with extraordinary speed. Walters was immediately transferred from his janitorial position to a newly established special technical unit, promoted to sergeant, and assigned a team of engineers to refine his prototype for mass production. Lieutenant Reynolds received a commendation for initiative and was appointed as administrative liaison for the project, though her role in identifying and championing Walter's talent would not be fully recognized until decades later. The first production models of what was officially designated the M7 Targeted Incursion Device, but which soldiers would simply call the Walters gun or the janitor's friend, reached North Africa in June 1942. Its impact was immediate and dramatic. During its first battlefield deployment near Benghazi, a single infantry unit, equipped with 17 Walters devices, destroyed 7 German tanks in less than 30 minutes without suffering a single casualty. German communication intercepts later revealed that panzer commanders initially believed they were facing a new, undisclosed heavy weapon rather than a man-portable system. By August 1942, the Walters device had been distributed to all Allied frontline units engaged with German armor, with priority given to British forces preparing for what would become the decisive Battle of El Alamein. Field reports consistently emphasized 2 revolutionary aspects of the weapon: its effectiveness against previously impervious German tanks and its usability by infantry soldiers with minimal specialized training. Unlike other anti-tank weapons that required extensive practice to master, Walters had specifically designed his device to be intuitive for the average soldier under combat stress. Captain Malcolm Fraser, commanding a British infantry company during the El Alamein offensive, later wrote, "The first time my men encountered Rommel's panzers with the new American weapon, I witnessed something I'd never thought possible: regular infantry actively engaging armor without artillery support and prevailing. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Where previously the mere sound of approaching tanks would send men looking for cover, they now moved toward the threat with confidence. The weapon's impact extended beyond direct combat applications. German commanders, suddenly facing effective resistance from standard infantry units, were forced to revise tactical doctrines that had previously relied on armor superiority. Panzer divisions began requiring increased infantry and artillery support, reducing their operational mobility and strategic flexibility. Intelligence reports indicated that Field Marshal Rommel personally demanded information about the new Allied weapon, believing it represented a significant technological leap rather than an elegant application of existing principles. While the Walters device was transforming battlefield dynamics, its creator maintained the same unassuming demeanor that had characterized his civilian life. When a journalist from Stars and Stripes attempted to interview him about his invention's growing reputation, Walters reportedly responded, "It's just plumbing with a different purpose. Anyone who's fixed a backed-up drain could have figured it out." This statement, while characteristic of Walters' humility, dramatically underrepresented the conceptual breakthrough his design represented. Major Lawrence Winters, head of the Aberdeen evaluation team that supervised refinement of the original prototype, provided a more accurate assessment. What makes Walters' innovation revolutionary isn't the specific mechanical arrangement, which is certainly clever, but the fundamental reconceptualization of the problem. Where everyone else saw a challenge of force versus resistance, a conceptual framework that led inevitably toward larger weapons and thicker armor in an endless cycle, he recognized that certain vulnerabilities are inherent to functional design and cannot be eliminated without rendering the system inoperable. It's a paradigm shift in approach rather than a mere technical improvement. By December 1942, the success of the Walters device had generated significant interest at the highest levels of Allied command. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, recently appointed as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in North Africa, requested a comprehensive briefing on both the weapon and its unlikely inventor. Following this briefing, Eisenhower made an unprecedented decision. Sergeant Edwin Walters would be brought to North Africa to observe his invention in field conditions and potentially develop modifications based on combat experience. This decision reflected both the weapon's critical importance to Allied strategy and Eisenhower's pragmatic leadership style. While conventional military protocol would have kept a technical developer safely behind the lines, Eisenhower recognized that Walters' unique perspective might yield further innovations if exposed to actual battlefield conditions. The decision would prove prophetic in ways no one anticipated. Walters arrived in Algiers on January 7, 1943, accompanied by Lieutenant Reynolds, whose administrative role had evolved into something closer to collaboration as she helped translate Walters' intuitive insights into the formal documentation required by military procurement systems. After a brief orientation, they were attached to a forward deployment of the 1st Infantry Division, which was preparing for operations against German positions in Tunisia. The practical education Walters received during the following weeks transformed his understanding of combat conditions in ways that technical reports could never convey. He observed soldiers using his device in training exercises, noted the practical difficulties they encountered, and witnessed firsthand the logistical challenges of maintaining precision equipment in desert conditions. Each evening, he modified his original designs based on these observations, working by lantern light in a requisitioned maintenance tent. On February 11th, while visiting an advanced position near the Kasserine Pass, Walters and Reynolds found themselves unexpectedly caught in what would become one of the most significant battles of the North African campaign. A surprise German counteroffensive broke through American lines, forcing a chaotic retreat that separated the two civilians from their military escort. Along with 24 infantrymen from various units, they took refuge in an abandoned farmhouse as German armor approached their position. What followed has been reconstructed from multiple eyewitness accounts later collected by Army historians. Finding themselves directly in the path of German tanks without anti-tank weapons, the stranded group faced almost certain capture or death. In this moment of crisis, Walters demonstrated that his mechanical intuition extended beyond invention to improvisation. Private First Class James Donovan described the scene. "We had nothing that could touch those tanks, not even a bazooka between us, let alone one of the Walters guns. We were preparing to surrender when the janitor, that's what someone called him though he had sergeant stripes, started gathering equipment from our vehicles. Fuel cans, radio parts, even brake fluid from a jeep. The lieutenant was helping him, like they had some kind of plan nobody else understood." Using materials scavenged from damaged vehicles, Walters constructed 5 improvised anti-tank devices based on his original design principles but adapted to available materials. The modifications required significant technical adjustments that he calculated without reference materials or measuring tools, working from intuitive understanding of the physical principles involved. "He didn't explain much," recalled Corporal Thomas Jenkins. "Just showed us where to position ourselves and when to trigger the devices. The whole time shells are landing nearby and tanks are getting closer, but he's focused like he's just fixing a sink back home." When 3 German Panzer IV tanks approached the farmhouse position, apparently unaware of the American presence, Walters coordinated an ambush using his improvised devices. 2 tanks were disabled in the initial engagement, while the third withdrew after sustaining damage to its track assembly. This unexpected resistance disrupted the German advance long enough for American artillery support to target the area, ultimately contributing to the defensive position that would allow Allied forces to regroup and prevent a complete breakthrough. News of Walters' battlefield improvisation reached General Omar Bradley, who was struggling to contain the German offensive. Recognizing the potential value of Walters' adaptability in the dynamic conditions of actual combat, Bradley temporarily attached both Walters and Reynolds to his tactical planning staff, an extraordinary position for a former janitor and a female officer in 1943. Over the following 2 weeks, Walters developed 7 distinct modifications to his original design, each addressing specific challenges encountered in combat conditions. These modifications, which included adaptations for different environmental conditions and simplified manufacturing processes to enable field repairs, were immediately transmitted to production facilities in the United States. The resulting design improvements were credited with increasing the weapon's effectiveness by approximately 40%, while reducing production costs by nearly 30%. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, arriving to assume command of American forces following the Kasserine engagement, initially expressed skepticism about the irregular arrangement that placed a recently promoted sergeant and a female lieutenant in positions of significant technical influence. After reviewing the combat performance data of Walters' original and modified designs, however, Patton became an enthusiastic advocate for the weapon and its creator. "I don't care if he was sweeping floors last month," Patton reportedly declared during a staff meeting. "The man has saved more American lives than half my medical corps. Get him whatever he needs." What Walters requested was not personal recognition, but expanded production capacity. Having observed the tactical impact of his invention firsthand, he proposed a manufacturing optimization that would increase monthly production by 65% without requiring additional factory space or raw materials. This proposal, implemented by April 1943, ensured that every Allied infantry unit in the European theater had access to the device before the Sicily invasion in July. By the time Walters returned to the United States in May 1943, his invention had been formally credited with the destruction of over 300 German tanks, while saving an estimated 5,000 Allied lives. He received the Distinguished Service Cross in a Pentagon ceremony, attended by senior military leadership and members of Congress. Extraordinary recognition for someone who had been emptying trash bins at Aberdeen just 14 months earlier. The public relations potential of Walters' story, the janitor whose invention changed the course of tank warfare, presented both opportunity and challenge for military leadership. While his background made for compelling newspaper copy, security considerations restricted how much technical detail could be publicly disclosed. The resulting compromise was a carefully managed media campaign that celebrated Walters' contribution while revealing little about the actual functioning of his device. This public recognition, though carefully controlled for security reasons, generated thousands of letters from civilians with their own inventions and suggestions for the war effort. Military leadership, now alert to the potential of unconventional talent, established a dedicated evaluation process for these submissions. While none proved as immediately transformative as Walters' device, several eventually contributed meaningful improvements to Allied technology. For Reynolds, whose career had been risked to bring Walters' invention to official attention, the North African experience provided professional validation but limited institutional recognition. Though privately acknowledged by Generals Eisenhower and Bradley for her role in identifying and advocating for Walters' talent, the official record initially minimized her contribution, a reflection of the era's gender limitations rather than deliberate oversight. It would be 1977, long after her retirement as one of the Army's first female colonels, before the full extent of her contribution was officially documented. The most significant institutional impact of the Walters case was the establishment of the Unconventional Technical Talent Initiative, UTTI, a specialized program designed to identify and utilize individuals with exceptional technical abilities, regardless of formal education or conventional credentials. This program, initially treated as experimental, eventually became a permanent component of military research and development, continuing in various forms through subsequent decades. Edwin Walters himself remained with the Army through the end of World War II, developing 9 additional combat systems based on his distinctive approach to existing engineering challenges. Following the Allied victory, he declined numerous private sector opportunities, including several that would have made him wealthy, in favor of continuing his work through the newly established UTTI program. When asked why he rejected more lucrative options, he reportedly responded with characteristic simplicity, "I'm not interested in money, I'm interested in solving problems." The full technical details of Walters' original anti-tank device remained classified until 1971, by which time weapons technology had advanced well beyond the specific mechanisms he had pioneered. Military historians reviewing the declassified material, however, identified his conceptual approach, targeting inherent system vulnerabilities rather than applying overwhelming force, as fundamentally influencing multiple weapon systems developed during the Cold War era. Dr. Eleanor Chambers, writing in the Journal of Military Technology in 1982, observed, "What distinguishes the Walters methodology is not merely the specific technical solution he developed for a particular combat challenge, but the conceptual framework that approach represented. By recognizing that complex systems necessarily contain vulnerabilities that cannot be eliminated without compromising essential functionality, he established an analytical approach that continues informing contemporary weapons design 4 decades later." The human impact of Walters' contribution extended far beyond statistical assessments of tanks destroyed or lives saved. For thousands of infantry soldiers who found themselves facing German armor with previously inadequate weapons, the sudden availability of effective countermeasures represented a profound shift in combat psychology. Contemporary accounts consistently reference not just the tactical advantage provided by the Walters device, but the restored sense of agency it gave to soldiers who had previously felt helpless against superior German technology. Sergeant Frank Miller, who served with the 1st Infantry Division throughout the North African and Italian campaigns, later recalled, "Before we got the Walters guns, seeing a Panzer meant you either found artillery support or you wrote yourself off. There's a special kind of hopelessness in that equation. After these devices reached us, the calculation changed completely. We weren't just targets anymore. We were hunters." That psychological shift saved as many lives as the weapon itself, because it meant we maintained tactical discipline instead of breaking formation when armor approached. Edwin Walters continued his work with the Army through the Korean conflict, developing specialized equipment for cold weather operations based on the same principles of identifying and exploiting inherent system vulnerabilities. Though he never again produced an innovation with the immediate impact of his anti-tank device, his cumulative contribution to military technology was substantial enough that the Aberdeen testing facility, where he had once emptied trash bins, was renamed the Edwin Walters Technical Evaluation Center in 1967. In the decades following World War II, as military technology increasingly emphasized electronic systems and later digital capabilities, the direct influence of Walters' mechanical innovations gradually diminished. The conceptual approach he pioneered, however, found new applications in cyber warfare, where identifying and exploiting necessary vulnerabilities in complex systems became a foundational methodology. When the National Security Agency established its first dedicated cyber operations unit in 1997, its founding documentation explicitly referenced the Walters principle of necessary vulnerability exploitation as a guiding conceptual framework. Lieutenant Sophia Reynolds, whose career following the North African campaign included increasingly significant technical oversight roles despite persistent institutional gender barriers, eventually received the Legion of Merit in 1965 for her cumulative contributions to military technology development. The citation made specific reference to her role in identifying unconventional talent, noting that Colonel Reynolds's distinctive ability to recognize technical insight regardless of its source significantly enhanced the Army's research and development capabilities across multiple conflict periods. The most enduring legacy of the Walters case, beyond specific technologies or conceptual frameworks, may be its demonstration of how institutional structures can simultaneously require and resist innovation. The same military organization that initially relegated a mechanical genius to janitorial duties, based on his limited formal education, later created specialized programs specifically designed to identify similar overlooked talent. This institutional learning process, while imperfect and incomplete, represented a meaningful evolution in how large organizations identify and utilize unconventional capabilities. Edwin Walters himself remained largely indifferent to questions of recognition or institutional dynamics. Throughout his 30-year association with the military, he maintained the same fundamental approach to technical challenges that had characterized his work from the beginning. Identify the underlying problem, recognize inherent system constraints, and develop solutions that work within those constraints rather than attempting to overcome them through brute force. This approach, revolutionary in 1942, eventually became standard methodology across multiple technical disciplines. In 1989, 7 years after Walters' death from heart failure at age 82, the Army established the Walters Medal for Technical Innovation, awarded annually to individuals who develop significant military technology through unconventional approaches or without formal technical credentials. The medal's inscription, "Insight Transcends Training," encapsulates the principle that Walters' career most powerfully demonstrated. Military historian Dr. Jonathan Stevenson, in his definitive 2004 study of World War II technological development, described Walters' contribution as the most consequential example of individual technical innovation directly influencing battlefield outcomes during the entire conflict. This assessment reflects not just the immediate tactical impact of Walter's anti-tank device, but its broader influence on how Allied forces approached technological challenges throughout the later stages of the war. The story of how a janitor revolutionized tank warfare through unconventional thinking continues influencing contemporary military innovation processes. At West Point, the United States Military Academy, engineering students participate in the annual Walters Challenge, tasked with developing solutions to complex problems using only limited, non-specialized materials. The exercise explicitly commemorates Walter's ability to conceptualize sophisticated weapons systems using components originally designed for entirely different purposes. Perhaps the most telling indicator of Walter's lasting significance came during a 2011 interview with retired General William Matthews, who had served as a junior officer during the North African campaign. Asked about his most vivid memory from that period, Matthews bypassed numerous famous battles and leadership encounters to recall the first time he witnessed the Walters device in action. "I watched 3 farm boys from Kansas take out 2 Panzers in less than 5 minutes without a scratch on them. Before that moment, those tanks would have rolled right through their position and kept going. That's when I understood we were going to win the war. Not just because we had more men or material, but because we had people who could think differently about problems that seemed impossible until they suddenly weren't." Edwin Walters himself, characteristically modest until the end of his life, offered perhaps the most insightful assessment of his own contribution during his final recorded interview in 1980. The so-called breakthrough wasn't really about the device itself. It was about permission to see the problem differently. Once you step outside the assumptions everyone else is making, solutions often become obvious. The real obstacle to innovation isn't technical, it's conceptual. We get locked into particular ways of thinking and forget to question whether the problem itself has been properly understood. This philosophical perspective, from a man with an 8th grade education, whose insights fundamentally altered the technological balance of World War II, perhaps represents the most valuable legacy of the janitor who became an overnight war hero. The recognition that breakthrough innovation often comes not from incremental improvements within established frameworks, but from the willingness to re-examine foundational assumptions that others have left unquestioned. In 2015, previously classified documents released by the Department of Defense revealed that Walter's original concept sketches, drawn on maintenance requisition forms during his janitorial shifts at Aberdeen, had been preserved in a special collection at the Pentagon. These sketches, remarkable for both their technical insight and their humble origins, now form part of the Smithsonian Institution's permanent exhibition on American military innovation, a testament to how profound impact can emerge from the most unlikely sources when insight is valued over credentials and effectiveness over convention.